Hey friends, tonight we are stepping out of your warm bed, your climate-controlled room, your refrigerator full of snacks, and your entire comfortable, modern existence, and dropping you, gently but firmly, into one of the most hostile environments this planet has ever produced. Tonight, we are visiting the Ice Age, not the animated movie version with the charming sloth and the neurotic squirrel, but the real thing. The actual bone-chilling survival is not guaranteed. The world is trying to kill you in 17 different ways. Ice Age. And here is the playful, but very honest reality check. This script is built around you probably wouldn't survive it. Not because you aren't smart or capable, but because the version of you that exists right now, shaped by central heating and grocery delivery, and shoes that were made by machines, that version of you is magnificently unprepared for what's out there tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing that someone in a quiet apartment in Oslo and someone on a porch in New Zealand are drifting off to the same frozen prehistoric world tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't arrive in the Ice Age dramatically. There is no lightning bolt, no spinning portal. One moment, you are here, and then you are simply there, standing on a wide, open plain, somewhere in what will one day become Central Europe, roughly 20,000 years ago, at the peak of the last glacial maximum. That is the term scientists use for the coldest, iciest point of the most recent ice age, when glaciers covered enormous portions of the northern hemisphere and sea levels were dramatically lower than anything you have ever seen on a map. The first thing you notice is the light. It is pale and thin, like sunlight filtered through frosted glass. The sky is a washed-out blue-gray, and the sun sits low even at midday, offering brightness without warmth, the way a lamp in a cold room technically illuminates but does nothing to help. The ground beneath your feet is hard, not cold pavement hard in a deeper, more geological sense, as if the earth itself has locked up and stopped cooperating. There is snow, but it is not the soft, picturesque kind. It is compacted and old, and slightly gray at the surface from wind-carried dust and sediment. Scientists have a name for that fine glacial dust, loess, and it traveled extraordinary distances during the Ice Age. Carried by relentless winds across the open tundra, you turn slowly, taking in the landscape, and it is genuinely breathtaking, not in a comfortable way, in a vast, humbling, slightly terrifying way. There are no trees immediately around you, just open steppe stretching in most directions, dotted with patches of low, scrubby vegetation poking through the snow. Far to the north, you can make out a suggestion of white on the horizon that isn't just snow-covered ground. That is the ice sheet itself, the actual glacier, and it is enormous in a way that photographs from Greenland today only partially capture. At its peak, the ice sheet over what is now Scandinavia was roughly 3 kilometers thick. That is not a typo. 3 kilometers of solid ice pressing down on the crust of the earth with enough weight to actually depress the bedrock beneath it. But things are about to get stranger the longer you stand there. Because the longer you stand still, the more you realize something important. You are already cold, not inconveniently chilly, not reaching for a sweater cold. You are cold in a way that is quietly urgent, the kind of cold that your body begins to treat as a priority message it cannot ignore. And you have been here for approximately 4 minutes. This is the first and most immediate problem with Ice Age survival, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on to the mammoths and the cave lions and all the other spectacular ways this world could end your story early. The cold itself, just the ambient temperature of the environment, is already working against you. Average temperatures during the last glacial maximum in continental Europe were roughly 10 to 15 degrees Celsius colder than today. In practical terms, a region that now experiences mild winters would have felt closer to the climate of modern Siberia. And Siberia, as anyone who has spent any time reading about it knows, is not a place where modern, unprepared humans go for a relaxing holiday. There is a widely accepted scientific fact worth planting here early because it reframes everything that comes after it. Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, people essentially identical to you and me, were already living through this. People with the same brain, the same body, the same basic biology you are carrying right now were out there in those conditions, not just surviving, but building cultures, creating art, developing language, and raising children. The famous cave paintings at Lascaux in France were made during a period when the climate was brutally cold by modern standards. That is not a small thing to absorb. The lesser-known fact that tends to surprise people is that the Ice Age world, despite its harshness, was not a silent or empty one. The Mammoth Steppe, the name given to the vast cold grassland ecosystem that stretched across much of Eurasia and into North America, was actually one of the most productive large mammal ecosystems the world has ever seen. There was an extraordinary abundance of life out there on that frozen plain, which sounds reassuring until you remember that most of that life was either something you would need to kill to eat or something that might try to kill you first. Scientists still debate the precise population density of Ice Age megafauna across different regions and time periods, and the ecological models continue to be refined as new fossil sites are discovered and existing ones are reanalyzed. What is not debated is that the landscape you are standing in right now is very much alive, even if, from where you are standing, it looks cold and still and deceptively quiet. You take one step forward on that hard gray snow, and somewhere in the middle distance, something moves. The thing that moved turns out to be a small herd of reindeer, picking their way slowly across the open ground, perhaps 300 meters to your left. They move with that particular unhurried patience that large herbivores have, heads down, breath misting, hooves crunching through the crusted snow in a rhythm that is almost meditative to watch. For a moment, standing there observing them, you feel something loosen slightly in your chest, something recognizable, something almost calming. Reindeer are not frightening. You know what reindeer are. You have seen pictures. There is even a cheerful cultural mythology built around them involving gift delivery and rooftop landings. And then the wind shifts, and the cold hits the left side of your face like a slow, flat hand. And whatever brief comfort the reindeer offered dissolves immediately, because the wind here is not a weather event. It is a condition. It is a permanent feature of this landscape, the same way gravity is a feature of the landscape. The Mammoth Steppe was an open, largely treeless environment, and open treeless environments do not buffer wind. They invite it. They give it a long, uninterrupted runway and let it build momentum for hundreds of kilometers before it arrives at your exact location and begins the quiet, efficient work of pulling heat from your body. This is the thing about Ice Age cold that is genuinely hard to convey without experiencing it. It is not just the temperature on a thermometer. It is the combination of temperature, wind, and moisture working together in a relentless, patient system. Meteorologists call this wind chill, and in ice age conditions, the effective felt temperature could drop dramatically below the already brutal ambient reading. On a day that registers minus 15 degrees Celsius on a thermometer, a moderate wind can push the felt temperature down to minus 30 or colder. At those levels, exposed human skin begins to experience frostnip within minutes. Frostnip progresses to frostbite faster than most people expect, and frostbite, left untreated, progresses to tissue death. All of this can begin to unfold in the time it might take you to finish a cup of coffee, if you had one, which you emphatically do not. Unfortunately, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that your body, specifically, is not calibrated for this. And this is not an insult. It is a physiological observation. Modern humans living in temperature-controlled environments have largely lost the behavioral and physiological edge that chronic cold exposure builds over time. Indigenous Arctic peoples and people who live and work in genuinely cold climates develop adaptations, both cultural and biological, that shift how their bodies respond to the cold. Their peripheral circulation behaves differently. Their metabolic responses are tuned differently. Their tolerance thresholds are genuinely higher. A person raised from childhood in a cold climate and a person raised from childhood in a centrally heated apartment are both fully human, but they are operating with meaningfully different cold weather hardware. And right now, yours is running a fairly outdated configuration. There is a widely accepted scientific fact embedded in this that researchers find consistently fascinating. The human body does have a baseline cold adaptation response. Brown adipose tissue, often called brown fat, generates heat through a process called thermogenesis, and it is activated by cold exposure. Infants have relatively large amounts of it. Adults retain some, particularly around the neck and shoulders. But chronic warmth suppresses its activity. In populations regularly exposed to cold, brown fat remains more metabolically active. In modern people living in warm indoor environments, it tends to sit largely dormant. You are standing on a glacial step, with your brown fat essentially asleep. And this is a small but meaningful detail in the larger story of why today is already not going your way. The surprising lesser-known fact here is about the hands. Human hands are extraordinarily vulnerable to cold, and they are also extraordinarily important for survival tasks, making fire, processing food, constructing shelter, crafting tools. Ice Age humans understood this implicitly, and the sophistication of prehistoric glove and mitten construction, evidenced by the careful placement of needle holes in ancient leather fragments and the design of some recovered hide clothing, suggests that hand protection was treated as a critical priority rather than an afterthought. Your hands, right now, have been outside your pockets for approximately 8 minutes of narrative time, and they are already beginning to ache in that deep bone-level way that precedes real numbness. Nature still has one more surprise waiting in how the cold interacts with your thinking, because cold does not only attack the body, it quietly degrades the mind. Cognitive performance under cold stress declines measurably. Reaction time slows. Decision-making becomes less precise. Problem-solving takes more effort. This is partly because the body, prioritizing core temperature, begins to reduce blood flow to the extremities and eventually begins to affect brain function as core temperature itself drops. Mild hypothermia, a core body temperature drop of just 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, produces confusion, poor judgment, and a reduced ability to recognize danger, which is, from a survival standpoint, an absolutely spectacular design flaw for an environment where good judgment and danger recognition are the two most important things you possess. Researchers have not fully agreed on the exact cognitive thresholds at which cold-induced impairment becomes operationally significant in wilderness survival contexts, partly because ethical constraints make controlled human hypothermia studies understandably difficult to run at scale. What field evidence and case studies consistently show, however, is that people in early hypothermia frequently make decisions that trained observers recognize as clearly self-defeating: removing clothing, wandering away from shelter, becoming inexplicably calm about their deteriorating situation. Doctors call this paradoxical undressing. It is more common than people expect. The reindeer have moved on. The plain is quiet again. The wind is steady and patient and completely indifferent to your situation. You look around at the open landscape and begin to perform the most basic survival calculation available to you. Which direction offers any protection at all? And the answer the landscape returns is deeply unhelpful. Every direction looks approximately the same: wide, pale, cold, and indifferent. This, right here, is the quiet core of the Ice Age survival problem. Not the mammoths, not the predators, not the scarcity of food. The cold itself, constant, ambient, inescapable, is the dominant fact of this world. Everything else is a secondary problem layered on top of it. Every other survival challenge you will face tonight is being run simultaneously with this one, and this one never pauses, never takes a day off, and never negotiates. You pull what is left of your modern clothing tighter around yourself and begin to walk, because movement generates heat. And right now, heat is the only currency that matters. Walking helps, not dramatically, not in a way that makes you feel warm exactly, but in the way that movement gives the body something to do with its panic, converts it into something purposeful and forward-moving. Your legs push through the crusted snow. Your arms swing. Your core temperature stabilizes slightly, and for a few minutes, you feel almost competent, almost like someone who could figure this out. This is, incidentally, a feeling that the Ice Age will work very hard to correct over the coming hours. But for now, you enjoy it. You follow the general direction the reindeer went. Because reindeer, like most large herbivores, tend to know things about the landscape that you do not. They know where the ground is more stable, where the wind is slightly less savage, where edible vegetation pokes through the snow in sufficient quantity to make travel worthwhile. Following large animals is one of the oldest navigation strategies in human history, and right now, it is also the best one available to you. But following animals and successfully eating them are two very different propositions. And this is where the Ice Age begins to expose one of the most persistent and quietly humbling gaps between how modern people imagine prehistoric survival and how it actually functioned. The gap is this: most people, when they imagine Ice Age hunting, picture something relatively direct. You see the animal, you approach the animal, some form of confrontation occurs. You eat. The reality was orders of magnitude more complicated, more skilled, more dangerous, and more frequently unsuccessful than that sequence implies. Hunting large Ice Age megafauna was not a casual activity. It was a sophisticated, highly technical, communally organized endeavor that drew on accumulated knowledge, specialized tools, deep understanding of animal behavior, and a significant tolerance for failure, because failure was the most common outcome. But things are about to get stranger, because even defining what Ice Age humans actually hunted and how often they succeeded turns out to be more complicated than the popular image suggests. The most widely accepted scientific fact in this space is that Ice Age humans were highly opportunistic and flexible in their diet. While the dramatic image of a mammoth hunt looms large in the popular imagination, the actual dietary record preserved in archaeological sites tells a more nuanced story. Small game, fish where available, birds, eggs, tubers, berries, seeds, and nuts all contributed meaningfully to the Ice Age diet depending on season and region. A group of humans in Ice Age Europe was not eating mammoth steak every night. They were eating whatever the landscape made available, which required a detailed working knowledge of dozens of different food sources and the skills to exploit each of them efficiently. The surprising, lesser-known fact is about the caloric math of large animal hunting. A single woolly mammoth, if successfully killed, represented an extraordinary caloric windfall. Estimates suggest a large adult mammoth could yield hundreds of kilograms of usable meat, fat, and organ tissue. Fat was particularly prized because in a cold environment, dietary fat is not just a food preference, but a physiological necessity. Your body burns significantly more calories simply maintaining core temperature in freezing conditions, and fat is the most calorie-dense fuel available. A hunter-gatherer group in Ice Age conditions needed substantially more daily calories than a modern sedentary person, and fat was the premium currency in that caloric economy. This is why Ice Age peoples, when they could, prioritized fatty tissues, marrow, brain, organ fat, in a way that might strike a modern observer as counterintuitive, but was in fact precisely calibrated nutritional logic. You, meanwhile, have been walking for what feels like an hour and have eaten nothing since sometime yesterday, in a different millennium entirely. Your stomach has moved past polite suggestion and into firm insistence, and the landscape around you is not making the situation easier. You can see the reindeer herd again, perhaps 200 meters ahead, and you have no weapon, no trap, no net, no strategy, and no particular experience in the physical confrontation of large animals. You have a vague cultural memory that early humans used spears, which is accurate, but manufacturing a functional spear from available materials in your current condition, cold hands, no tools, no prior experience, is not something that is going to happen in the next 20 minutes. The truly odd part comes later, which is that even experienced Ice Age hunters, equipped with purpose-built weapons and working in coordinated groups, faced a success rate on large game hunts that was far from guaranteed. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies, which researchers use cautiously but usefully as partial analogs for prehistoric behavior, suggest that large animal hunting attempts frequently fail. Animals are faster, stronger, more perceptive, and more unpredictable than they appear from a distance. A wounded large animal is significantly more dangerous than an unwounded one, and a hunt that injures a hunter creates a cascading problem for the whole group, because an injured hunter cannot contribute to the next hunt, cannot help with camp maintenance, and requires care and resources from others at a time when resources are already stretched. Scientists still debate the precise role that large megafauna hunting played in the overall subsistence strategy of different Ice Age human populations, with some researchers arguing for a much heavier reliance on plant foods and small game than the dramatic hunting imagery implies, while others point to isotopic analysis of prehistoric human bones, which can reveal dietary patterns, suggesting that in some regions and time periods, large animal protein dominated the diet significantly. The honest answer is probably that it varied enormously by location, season, and the specific ecology available to any given group. What is not debated is that acquiring food in this environment required a level of skill, knowledge, and preparation that you cannot improvise on arrival. The reindeer herd drifts further away, unbothered, moving with that same unhurried patience they had when you first spotted them. You watch them go and make a quiet mental note that hunger in this world is not a minor inconvenience that can be solved by opening a different cabinet. It is a structural feature of daily life that shapes every decision, every movement, every social relationship, and every plan. The Ice Age humans who thrived were the ones who had spent their entire lives learning to navigate that fact with extraordinary skill and almost no margin for error. You are not those people. Not yet. And the sun is already beginning to drop toward the horizon. The sun dropping toward the horizon in the Ice Age is not a gentle golden hour kind of event. It is a warning, a slow, pale withdrawal of the only meaningful warmth source available to you, and the landscape responds to it with an almost audible tightening. The air sharpens. The wind picks up a degree of seriousness it didn't quite have an hour ago, and the shadows stretching across the snow take on a blue-gray quality that feels less like evening and more like the world quietly closing a door. You have been walking for hours. You have eaten nothing, and the cold that was merely urgent this morning has graduated into something more insistent and less patient. And then, approximately 200 meters to your right, something large moves through a shallow depression in the ground. And it is not a reindeer. It is bigger than a reindeer, considerably bigger, and it is moving with the kind of unhurried, weight-bearing momentum that only very large animals possess. The sort of movement that communicates, without any aggression whatsoever, that the creature producing it does not particularly worry about what else might be sharing its landscape. You have just encountered the megafauna problem. The term megafauna refers broadly to large animals, and the Ice Age world was, by any reasonable measure, extravagantly well stocked with them. The creature currently crossing the depression to your right is a woolly mammoth, a mature female, based on her size, though mature female woolly mammoths were still approximately 3 meters tall at the shoulder and weighed somewhere in the range of 4 to 6 metric tons. She is covered in long, shaggy reddish-brown outer hair over a dense, woolly undercoat, and her tusks curve forward and slightly upward in the distinctive shape that mammoth tusks are famous for. She is, objectively, one of the most magnificent things you have ever seen. She is also completely indifferent to your existence, which is both reassuring and, in its own way, slightly deflating. But things are about to get stranger, because the mammoth is not the animal you actually need to worry about most in this landscape. The widely accepted scientific fact about Ice Age megafauna is that the range and diversity of large animals during this period was genuinely extraordinary by any modern comparison. Europe alone hosted woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, cave hyenas, cave bears, giant deer, sometimes called Irish elk, though they ranged far beyond Ireland, steppe bison, aurochs, and horses. North America had its own spectacular roster, including mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, American lions, saber-toothed cats, giant beavers, and camels. Yes, camels. North American camels. The Ice Age world was ecologically dense, with large animals in a way that has no modern equivalent anywhere on Earth outside of the most protected African wildlife reserves. And even those are a diminished shadow of what the mammoth steppe once supported. The surprising, lesser-known fact is about cave lions. and it is a fact that tends to recalibrate people's sense of scale quite efficiently. The cave lion, Panthera spelaea, was not simply a cold-weather version of a modern African lion. It was significantly larger, with some estimates suggesting it was among the largest felids ever to exist, potentially 10 to 30% larger than a modern lion. It lacked the prominent mane of the African lion, based on cave paintings that depict it, and it was almost certainly a more cold-adapted, open-terrain hunter. A modern African lion is already an animal that commands serious respect from every other creature in its ecosystem. A cave lion, larger and likely highly effective across the open mammoth steppe, occupied a predator role that had essentially no parallel in today's world, outside of perhaps a very large Siberian tiger. And even that comparison undersells it somewhat. The mammoth has moved past now, disappearing into a fold in the landscape with the quiet efficiency of something that has been navigating this terrain its entire life. You watch her go and feel the particular mix of awe and vulnerability that large wild animals tend to produce in people who have only ever encountered them through glass or screens. The open ground she crossed is now empty again, and the light is another degree lower, and you are standing in the middle of an ecosystem that contains cave lions. Scientists still debate the precise hunting strategies and prey preferences of Pleistocene large predators, including whether cave lions primarily targeted megafauna, like mammoths and rhinoceroses, or focused more heavily on mid-sized prey, like horses and deer. The evidence from fossil assemblages and isotopic analysis is suggestive, but not conclusive, and the honest position is that different individuals and different regional populations may have developed quite different hunting specializations, depending on what the local landscape offered. What is not debated is that these were apex predators of the highest order, and that the open terrain of the mammoth steppe offered relatively little in the way of hiding places for anything they decided to investigate. And this introduces a survival dynamic that is easy to underestimate when you are reading about the Ice Age from a comfortable room. You are not at the top of the food chain. Modern humans have grown so accustomed to occupying the apex predator role in essentially every ecosystem we enter that the psychological adjustment required to genuinely inhabit a world where large, capable predators view you as a potential meal is more significant than it sounds. Ice Age humans were not helpless prey animals, not by any means. They were intelligent, tool-using, socially organized, and formidable in the right circumstances. But they were also small, relatively slow, without natural armor or weapons, and operating in an environment where multiple predator species were larger, faster, and better equipped for cold weather hunting than they were. The short-faced bear of North America, Arctodus simus, deserves a particular mention here because it tends to generate a specific kind of stunned silence when people encounter its dimensions for the first time. Standing on all fours, it reached roughly 1.5 meters at the shoulder. On its hind legs, it may have reached 3.5 meters. It was long-legged for a bear, suggesting it was capable of covering ground at speeds that its bulk might not imply. It was almost certainly an intimidating presence in any landscape it occupied, and the humans who shared North America with it during the late Pleistocene were doing so without firearms, without vehicles, and without any of the technological buffers that currently sit between modern humans and the concept of large predatory animals. You look in several directions simultaneously, which is not physically possible, but feels like the appropriate response to your current situation. The plain is quiet. Nothing is visibly approaching. But the light is nearly gone now, and the temperature is dropping with the focused intent of something that has been planning this all day, and you still have no shelter, no fire, and no idea where the cave lions are. The darkness in the Ice Age is a different quality of dark than anything your modern life has prepared you for. There are no streetlights bleeding orange across the horizon. There are no distant windows glowing from houses you cannot see. There is no ambient light pollution softening the night into something navigable. When the sun finishes its pale withdrawal and the last gray light drains from the western sky, the darkness that replaces it is total and immediate, and slightly shocking in a way that takes a moment to process. The stars are extraordinary, genuinely, breathtakingly extraordinary, more stars than you have probably ever seen in one sky, blazing with a clarity that the modern world has largely forgotten is possible. But stars, beautiful as they are, do not meaningfully warm you or illuminate the ground well enough to build anything useful. They are, tonight, mostly decorative. You need shelter, not tomorrow, not in an hour, now. The urgency of this is worth pausing on for a moment, because shelter in the Ice Age was not a comfort consideration. It was not the difference between a good night and a bad night. It was, with only moderate exaggeration, the difference between waking up at all and not waking up at all. A human body exposed to temperatures of -15 to -20 degrees Celsius through an Ice Age night without adequate insulation and windbreak faces a genuinely serious survival timeline. Severe hypothermia can develop within hours under those conditions, particularly if the person is already calorie depleted and physically fatigued, which you emphatically are. The body can fight cold for a while. Shivering, the metabolic heat response, is a remarkably effective short-term warming mechanism. But shivering is expensive. It burns calories rapidly, and you have no calories to spare. And the moment shivering stops, because the body has run out of fuel to sustain it, core temperature begins to drop in earnest. Unfortunately, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that building effective shelter from scratch, in freezing temperatures, in the dark, with no prior experience, and hands that are already borderline non-functional from cold exposure, is genuinely one of the hardest practical tasks you could attempt under these conditions. And it is a task that Ice Age humans did not approach as an emergency improvisation. They approached it as a practiced, skilled, materially sophisticated craft that took years to develop and that drew on accumulated generational knowledge about what worked, what failed, and what would kill you faster than the cold itself. The shelters that Ice Age humans built varied considerably by region and available materials. In areas where caves were accessible, cave occupation was common, and caves provided genuine, significant advantages. They offered windbreak, stable interior temperatures that were cold but not as extreme as the outside air, and walls that could be insulated with hides and bedding material. The famous cave sites of southwestern Europe, the ones with the paintings, were not just art galleries. They were homes, or at least seasonal habitations, chosen and maintained because they offered structural protection that was difficult to replicate in the open landscape. But caves were not universally available, and the open mammoth steppe that covered vast stretches of Eurasia offered a different and fascinating building tradition that archaeology has only relatively recently begun to fully appreciate. In regions of Ukraine and Russia, researchers have excavated the remains of structures built from mammoth bones, not crude piles of bones, but carefully constructed frameworks using mammoth skulls, jaw bones, and long limb bones arranged in deliberate, architectural patterns. These structures, some of which date to around 15,000 years ago, were substantial enough to have supported hide coverings and to have served as real, functional winter shelters. Building one required not just the bones themselves, which had to be sourced, transported, and prepared, but a working knowledge of structural engineering principles that the builders understood intuitively through practice and tradition, even without any formal framework for describing what they knew. The widely accepted scientific fact here is that the thermal performance of a well-constructed, hide-covered shelter in cold conditions is genuinely impressive. Animal hides, particularly when multiple layers are used and the interior is further insulated with dried grass, moss, or additional bedding material, create an environment that can maintain survivable temperatures even when outside conditions are brutal. The physics are straightforward. Dead airspace trapped within the insulating layers resists heat transfer. Body heat from the occupants warms the interior, and a small fire or lamp-burning animal fat can raise the interior temperature dramatically above the outside air. A well-made Ice Age shelter was not comfortable by modern standards, but it was functional in exactly the way that mattered. It kept its occupants alive through conditions that would otherwise kill them. The surprising lesser-known fact is about the lamps. Ice Age humans used small stone lamps burning animal fat, typically a shallow depression carved or naturally occurring in a stone, filled with rendered fat and fitted with a wick of moss or lichen or plant fiber. These lamps burned with a small, steady flame that provided both light and a modest but meaningful heat contribution. Hundreds of these lamps have been recovered from archaeological sites across Europe, some elaborately carved, some entirely utilitarian. They are one of the most quietly important technologies in human prehistory, a portable, renewable light and heat source that could be carried, shared, and maintained with materials available in the Ice Age landscape. The cave paintings at sites like Lascaux were made by the light of these lamps, which means the artists were working in the flickering, intimate glow of rendered animal fat deep inside cave systems, producing images of extraordinary beauty and precision under conditions that a modern artist with a deadline and a proper studio might find somewhat challenging. You have no lamp, you have no hides, you have no mammoth bones, and no structural knowledge, and no moss for wicking, and no rendered fat for fuel. What you have is a rapidly deepening night, a wind that has found a new and personal interest in the back of your neck, and a growing appreciation for the difference between knowing that prehistoric people built shelters and actually knowing how to build one. Nature still has one more surprise waiting, which is that the psychological component of this situation is beginning to make itself known alongside the physical one. Darkness in a genuinely wild landscape, without any artificial light source, produces a specific quality of alertness in the human nervous system. A heightened, slightly electric attention to sound and movement that is ancient and automatic and not entirely pleasant to experience. Every creak of frozen ground, every distant sound carried on the wind, every shift in the ambient darkness registers as potentially significant. Your nervous system, quite reasonably, is treating this as the high alert situation that it is. Scientists still debate the precise nature and extent of Ice Age human shelter construction across different regions, with ongoing excavations continuing to reveal new evidence that complicates earlier models. What new sites in Siberia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe consistently demonstrate is that Ice Age humans were far more sophisticated builders than the popular image of the cave-dwelling primitive implies. They were engineers working with available materials, applying accumulated knowledge to solve a problem that admitted no partial solutions. Half a shelter was not meaningfully better than no shelter. The craft had to work completely, every time, because the consequence of it not working was not inconvenience. It was death, arriving quietly on a frozen night very much like this one. You find a slight depression in the ground where two low ridges of earth create a partial windbreak, and you lower yourself into it and pull your knees to your chest, and you begin the long, cold, deeply uncomfortable work of waiting for a morning that is many hours away. Sometime in the deep middle of the night, when the cold has settled into your bones, with the patient thoroughness of something that has all the time in the world, you become aware of a new problem. It arrives not dramatically, but quietly, the way most serious problems in the Ice Age seem to prefer. A dryness in your throat, a thickness on your tongue, a particular kind of headache beginning to build behind your eyes that you recognize, dimly and with some surprise, as thirst. You are surrounded by frozen water. It is literally everywhere. The ground beneath you is frozen. The air carries ice crystals in it. There is a ridge of wind-packed snow, perhaps 4 meters to your left, that represents more water than you could drink in a week. And you are dehydrating. This is one of the Ice Age's most counterintuitive survival traps, and it catches people conceptually, even when they are reading about it in warm rooms, let alone experiencing it in a frozen depression on a glacial steppe in the middle of the night. The instinctive logic says that a landscape covered in frozen water should not produce dehydration risk. The instinctive logic is wrong, and understanding why it is wrong reveals something important about how the Ice Age body budget actually worked. The first part of the problem is respiratory. In cold, dry air, every breath you exhale carries moisture out of your body. The air in Ice Age continental environments was significantly drier than the air in most modern temperate climates. The cold suppresses atmospheric moisture content, and the open steppe offered none of the humidity buffering that forests and bodies of liquid water provide. Breathing in that air, hour after hour, represents a continuous and largely invisible water loss that accumulates steadily without producing the obvious, immediate sensation of thirst that liquid dehydration typically triggers. By the time you feel noticeably thirsty in cold conditions, you are frequently already meaningfully dehydrated. But things are about to get stranger because the snow surrounding you is not a straightforward solution to this problem. Eating snow to address thirst and dehydration is one of those survival instincts that feels logical and is, in practice, genuinely problematic in cold conditions. Snow is not simply cold water. It is frozen water that your body must melt using its own heat. And melting snow internally requires a caloric expenditure that your already depleted system cannot comfortably afford. Each mouthful of snow your body melts represents heat pulled from your core, which is precisely the resource you are most desperately trying to conserve. In a survival situation where hypothermia is already a live concern, eating snow to address dehydration is a trade that frequently costs more than it recovers. The water you gain is real, but modest. The thermal cost you pay is also real and not modest, and in the wrong conditions, the exchange tips decisively against you. The widely accepted scientific fact here is that the recommended approach in cold survival contexts is always to melt snow before consuming it using an external heat source, a fire, a heated container, any method that puts the caloric cost of phase change onto something other than your body's core temperature regulation system. Ice Age humans understood this practically if not in those terms, which is one of several reasons why fire was not simply a convenient luxury in this world. It was a water production technology as much as a heating and cooking technology, and groups that maintained reliable fire had access to liquid water in a landscape where liquid water was otherwise almost entirely absent for large portions of the year. The surprising, lesser-known fact involves the relationship between cold and thirst perception, and it is one that even experienced cold weather travelers find counterintuitive until they have encountered it firsthand. Cold suppresses the thirst mechanism, the physiological pathways that signal dehydration to your conscious awareness are blunted in cold conditions, producing a situation where your body is losing water steadily, but not generating the normal urgency signals that would prompt you to drink. Researchers studying cold weather dehydration in military and expedition contexts have found that people operating in cold environments frequently consume far less water than their bodies actually require, not because water is unavailable, but because they simply do not feel thirsty enough to seek it out proactively. The result is a chronic, mild to moderate dehydration that compounds physical fatigue, degrades cognitive performance, and reduces cold tolerance, all of which are things you absolutely cannot afford to have degraded further at this particular moment. The truly odd part comes later, which is how dehydration and cold interact in the context of physical performance. Dehydrated muscles fatigue faster and recover more slowly. Dehydrated blood is slightly thicker and circulates less efficiently, which means the cardiovascular effort required to maintain body temperature and support physical activity increases at exactly the moment when your energy reserves are already running low. It is a compounding system, each problem making the others slightly worse, in the way that Ice Age survival challenges consistently refused to stay in their separate categories and instead blended into a single, interconnected web of difficulty that had to be managed as a whole, rather than addressed one piece at a time. Paleontologists and archaeologists continue to argue about the water sourcing strategies of Ice Age human populations in different regions and seasons. Evidence from some sites suggests deliberate settlement near water sources that remained liquid through winter, geothermally active areas, fast-moving rivers that resisted full freezing, coastal environments where ocean water influenced local climate. Other evidence suggests that populations moved seasonally in patterns partly organized around water access, which adds another layer of complexity to the already sophisticated logistical picture of Ice Age human life. The precise decision-making calculus that guided these movements is not recoverable from the archaeological record with certainty, but the movements themselves are increasingly well documented. You look at the ridge of snow 4 meters away and perform the calculation your body is demanding you perform, and you decide that the correct answer is to do nothing about it right now, which is its own particular kind of misery. Somewhere in the back of your mind, a grudging respect is forming for the people who manage this landscape, not for one terrible night, but for entire lifetimes, who knew exactly where the water was, exactly when it was safe to drink from, exactly how to process it and store it and ration it across the long frozen months when the landscape offered nothing in liquid form without significant effort. The stars have wheeled slightly overhead, which means time is passing even if nothing else seems to be changing. The cold is the same. The wind is the same. The darkness is the same. But the stars have moved, and somewhere out beyond the ridge of snow, something calls once in the darkness, a long, low sound that carries easily across the frozen plain. and then falls silent again. You decide not to think too carefully about what made that sound. Morning arrives the way Ice Age mornings apparently always do. Not with warmth, not with birdsong, not with any of the gentle sensory cues that modern humans have come to associate with the beginning of a new day, but with a slow, grudging lightening of the eastern sky that seems less like sunrise and more like the darkness reluctantly agreeing to become slightly less complete. You are stiff in every joint. Your fingers have spent the night cycling between aching and numb, and the hollow, uncomfortable feeling in your core that is partly hunger and partly cold, and partly the accumulated fatigue of a night spent shivering in a frozen depression has settled in with the air of something that intends to stay. But you are alive, which is genuinely not a foregone conclusion, and the pale light returning to the landscape feels, despite everything, like a small mercy. The first thing the morning light reveals is that your clothing situation is more urgent than you allowed yourself to fully acknowledge last night. What you are wearing, whatever combination of modern fabrics your particular bedtime wardrobe involved, is not adequate for this environment in any meaningful technical sense. Modern synthetic fabrics are actually quite good at moisture management and insulation under many conditions, but they are designed for a world where you have backup options, where you can change when things get wet, where your clothing is one layer of a multi-layered system that includes shelter and heating. Out here, your clothing is the entire system, and it is failing at the most fundamental level. It was not made for this, and the materials available to replace or supplement it require a set of skills that represent one of the most underappreciated technical achievements in all of human prehistory. The widely accepted scientific fact about Ice Age clothing is that it was far more sophisticated than the cartoonish fur loincloth image that has dominated popular imagination for most of modern history. Archaeological evidence, including the recovery of ancient sewing needles made from bone and ivory, some of them extraordinarily fine and precise, dating back 25,000 years or more, demonstrates that Ice Age humans were making tailored, fitted, multi-layered garments with a level of technical sophistication that genuinely surprises researchers encountering it for the first time. These were not draped hides loosely belted at the waist. They were cut and stitched garments designed to fit the human body, minimize cold air gaps, and layer effectively against different conditions. The Ice Age equivalent of technical outdoor clothing, produced without any of the industrial infrastructure we take for granted. But things are about to get stranger, because making those garments required a process that began long before any needle touched any hide, and that process was itself a demanding, skilled, multi-stage operation. Processing an animal hide into usable clothing material is not a simple task. A fresh hide taken from a hunted animal is heavy, stiff, and will rot if not treated promptly and correctly. The process of turning it into soft, workable leather, a process called tanning, or, in one of its most traditional forms, brain tanning, which uses the animal's own brain tissue as a processing agent, involves scraping, soaking, working, stretching, and smoking the hide through a series of labor-intensive steps that take days to complete and require significant physical effort and precise knowledge of when each stage is finished and the next should begin. Get it wrong, and the hide either rots, or it dries stiff and inflexible and useless, or it becomes fragile and tears under stress. Get it right, and you have a material that is soft, strong, water-resistant to a degree, and genuinely effective as cold weather insulation. The surprising lesser-known fact is about the stitching. Ice Age needles recovered from sites across Eurasia are sometimes so fine, barely a millimeter in diameter at the eye, that researchers initially struggled to understand how they were manufactured with stone tools. The answer involves extraordinary patience, extraordinary skill, and a deep familiarity with bone and ivory as materials that respond to specific working techniques in predictable ways. The thread used in Ice Age sewing was typically made from sinew, the tough connective tissue from animal tendons, which is strong, naturally slightly elastic, and critically, swells when wet, which caused seams to tighten and become more waterproof rather than loosening and leaking as many modern thread materials would. This is not accidental. This is the product of deep material knowledge accumulated across generations and refined through constant, practical application. You look at your hands in the morning light and try to imagine performing the fine motor work that needle manufacturing and hide stitching require, and your hands, stiff and aching and still not entirely reliable at the fingertip level, provide a fairly clear answer about how that would go right now. Ice Age tailors worked in cold conditions too, of course, but they had warm shelters to work in. Body temperature hands warmed by fire and activity, and most importantly, they had spent their entire lives building the specific, fine motor skills that this work demands. Those skills were not optional extras. They were core survival competencies, taught to children early and practiced continuously, because a group whose clothing failed in the middle of winter was a group with a rapidly diminishing life expectancy. Nature still has one more surprise, waiting in the material hierarchy of Ice Age clothing, which is the role of footwear. Foot protection in extreme cold is not simply a comfort matter. Frostbitten feet are non-functional feet, and non-functional feet in a world where walking is your only transportation option represent a cascade of consequences that are difficult to recover from. Ice Age footwear, evidenced by impressions left in ancient clay floors at some sites and by the wear patterns on certain recovered artifacts, was carefully constructed with insulating layers and waterproofing strategies that modern outdoor boot designers would recognize as sound engineering. Some researchers have argued that the development of sophisticated cold weather footwear was among the enabling technologies that allowed modern humans to expand into the coldest regions of the Ice Age world, including northeastern Siberia and eventually across the land bridge into the Americas. Scientists still debate the precise timeline and technical development of Ice Age clothing traditions, partly because organic materials, like hide and sinew, survive in the archaeological record only under exceptional preservation conditions. What does survive? The needles, the awls, the scrapers, the indirect evidence of tailored garments from frozen or desiccated burials in much later periods paints a picture of a clothing tradition that was as technically demanding and culturally significant as any other aspect of Ice Age material culture. The people who dressed themselves and their children against this cold were not doing something simple. They were practicing a sophisticated craft that stood between their families and the environment with the same functional importance as shelter and fire. You pull your inadequate modern fabric tighter and feel, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, the specific texture of being genuinely underprepared for the world you are currently inhabiting. The morning light has strengthened enough now that the landscape reveals itself in fuller detail. And what it reveals, perhaps surprisingly, is that you are not alone. Perhaps half a kilometer to the southeast, partially obscured by a low rise in the ground, there is smoke. Not the dramatic billowing kind, but the thin, pale, almost tentative kind that a carefully managed fire produces when the people tending it know exactly what they are doing and are not wasting fuel. It rises in a slow, wavering column and then gets taken apart by the wind maybe 30 meters up, dispersing into nothing. But for those 30 meters, it is the most important thing in the landscape, because it means people. And people, in the Ice Age, are the single most valuable resource you could possibly encounter this morning, outranking food, outranking water, outranking any other survival consideration by a margin that is difficult to overstate. This is the section where the narrative has to be honest about something that survival culture in the modern world frequently underemphasizes in favor of individual competence and self-reliance. Solo survival in the Ice Age was not a viable long-term strategy. It was not a difficult but achievable challenge for a sufficiently skilled individual. It was, for almost all practical purposes, a slow death sentence with a variable timeline depending on the season, the individual's condition, and how much accumulated bad luck the landscape chose to deliver. The fundamental unit of Ice Age survival was not the individual, it was the group, and understanding what that group actually provided and how it functioned reframes the entire picture of what human life during this period actually looked like. But things are about to get stranger, because the social structure of Ice Age human groups was not simply a practical arrangement of mutual convenience. It was a sophisticated, carefully maintained web of relationships, obligations, knowledge-sharing systems, and cultural frameworks that represented tens of thousands of years of accumulated social evolution. And it was every bit as important to survival as any physical tool or material technology. The widely accepted scientific fact here is that Ice Age human groups were not isolated bands of a few dozen individuals who had no contact with other groups. The archaeological evidence, including the distribution of distinctive tool-making styles across vast geographic distances, the movement of specific raw materials, like high-quality flint and obsidian, hundreds of kilometers from their geological sources, and the similarity of artistic traditions across regions, strongly suggests that Ice Age human populations maintained extensive social networks connecting multiple groups across large territories. These networks were not casual. They were deliberately maintained through periodic gatherings, gift exchange, intermarriage between groups, and shared cultural practices that created and reinforced bonds of obligation and mutual support across distances that required days or weeks of travel to traverse. The surprising lesser-known fact is about the economics of these social networks, and specifically about the concept that researchers sometimes call social storage. In an environment where food availability was highly variable, a successful large animal hunt might produce a temporary surplus that could not all be immediately consumed or effectively preserved, while a string of unsuccessful hunts might leave a group genuinely hungry. The social network itself functioned as a storage system, sharing food generously with allied groups during times of plenty created social debts that could be called upon during times of scarcity. A group that had fed its neighbors during a productive season could reasonably expect to receive food in return during a difficult one. This system required trust, memory, and a shared cultural framework for tracking and honoring obligations across time. But it functioned as a remarkably effective buffer against the worst outcomes of a highly variable food supply. You are moving toward the smoke now, because the alternative is standing in the cold alone. And whatever social anxieties the modern world has equipped you with about approaching strangers, this particular morning has thoroughly reorganized your priorities. As you crest the low rise and look down into the shallow valley below, you see the group, perhaps 20 to 30 people, of various ages gathered around and near a substantial fire, with several hide structures visible behind them and the organized debris of a functioning camp spread across the valley floor. There are children, there are elderly individuals, there are people working at various tasks, scraping hides, tending the fire, processing what appears to be food of some kind. The scene is busy and purposeful, and from your cold and hungry vantage point on the ridge, almost unbearably welcoming. The truly odd part comes later in understanding exactly how much specialized knowledge is distributed across those 20 to 30 people in ways that make the group collectively far more capable than any individual within it could ever be alone. One person in that group knows the landscape for 50 kilometers in every direction, with the intimacy of someone who has walked it in every season for 20 years. Another knows the medicinal properties of the plants that grow along the riverbank 2 days' walk to the south. Another is the group's most skilled flint knapper, capable of producing tools of a precision and efficiency that take a decade of practice to achieve. Another knows the songs and stories that encode geographic information, seasonal calendars, and social history in forms that can be transmitted to children and remembered without writing. The knowledge base of that group, pooled and shared and maintained across generations, is the real survival technology. More important than any individual tool or technique, scientists still debate the precise size and composition of Ice Age human social groups, with estimates for typical band size ranging from perhaps 15 to 50 individuals for the primary residential group, embedded within a larger network of affiliated groups that might total several hundred people across a broader territory. The evidence for these larger networks comes from the material culture distribution patterns mentioned earlier, and researchers continue to refine their models as new sites are excavated and existing analyses are revisited with new techniques. What the evidence consistently supports, regardless of the specific numbers, is a picture of Ice Age humanity that was far more socially connected and organizationally sophisticated than the isolated cave family image implies. One of the people near the fire has noticed you on the ridge. They are watching you with the calm, assessing attention of someone accustomed to evaluating unfamiliar situations quickly and accurately. They do not look frightened. They look, if anything, curious. The same quality of focused curiosity that the landscape itself seems to demand from everyone who inhabits it. You raise one hand in a gesture that you hope communicates something like peaceful intention, and after a moment, they raise one hand in return. You walk down into the valley, toward the fire, toward the warmth, and the people, and the thin smoke. That has just become the most important thing that has happened to you since you arrived in this world. And for the first time since you got here, something that might cautiously be described as relief begins to replace the low-level hum of alarm that has been your constant companion since you opened your eyes on that frozen plain yesterday morning. The fire is extraordinary, not because it is large, it is actually carefully controlled, smaller than you might have expected, built in a shallow pit that concentrates and reflects its heat upward with an efficiency that speaks to long practice, but because of what it represents after the night you have just survived. Heat, actual, radiating, immediate heat that you can hold your hands toward and feel responding to in real time. The sensation moving from your fingertips inward as circulation returns to places that have been waiting patiently for hours. You sit close enough that the warmth becomes the dominant fact of your sensory world for a few minutes, pushing everything else, the smell of the camp, the sounds of the group around you, the unfamiliar textures of the landscape into the background. Your nervous system, which has been running at a particular elevated frequency since yesterday morning, begins very slightly to downshift. But while you sit by this fire in a shallow valley, somewhere in Ice Age Europe, absorbing heat and feeling something approaching gratitude for the first time since you arrived, the landscape around this small group of people is presenting its own quiet puzzle. Because nothing about this valley, this campsite, this geography looks the way any map you have ever studied would lead you to expect. And this is not simply a matter of the glaciers and the cold and the general prehistoric atmosphere of the place. It is more specific and more disorienting than that. The actual physical shape of this world is different from the world you know, in ways that would make navigation using any modern reference point essentially impossible. This is the Ice Age geography problem, and it is one of the most fascinating and least discussed aspects of what life during this period actually involved. The widely accepted scientific fact is that sea levels during the last glacial maximum were approximately 120 to 130 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. The implications of this single fact reshape the entire map of the world in ways that take a moment to fully absorb. Britain was not an island. It was connected to continental Europe by a broad landmass that researchers call Doggerland, a territory of rivers, wetlands, and plains that was home to both animals and people, and now lies entirely beneath the North Sea. The Indonesian archipelago was largely a single continuous landmass. Australia was connected to New Guinea. The Bering Land Bridge between Siberia and Alaska, Beringia, was not a narrow crossing, but a vast subcontinent in its own right, hundreds of kilometers wide, with its own ecology and its own human and animal populations. The coastlines of every continent were dramatically different, often extending tens or hundreds of kilometers beyond their current positions. But things are about to get stranger, because lower sea levels were only one component of the geographic transformation. The rivers were different too, with glaciers covering enormous portions of the northern landmasses and absorbing water that would otherwise flow to the sea. Drainage patterns across the unglaciated regions were substantially altered. Rivers that exist today did not exist then, or ran different courses. Rivers that no longer exist were major geographic features that Ice Age populations navigated, settled near, and named in languages we will never recover. The Rhine extended far across what is now the North Sea floor. The Thames joined the Rhine in that vanished lowland. The Mediterranean had different coastlines, different islands, different connections to the Atlantic. The surprising, lesser-known fact is about what this geographic transformation meant for human navigation and the transmission of geographic knowledge. Ice Age humans navigated their landscapes using landmarks, specific hills, rock formations, river confluences, distinctive vegetation patterns that they encoded in memory, song, story, and oral tradition. The detailed geographic knowledge required to move successfully across large territories was accumulated over generations and transmitted with considerable care, because getting lost in this landscape, as you can personally attest from yesterday's experience on the open plain, was not a minor inconvenience. It was a survival emergency. Some researchers have argued that certain features of Ice Age art and symbol systems may encode geographic information, that some of the marks and patterns found in prehistoric sites represent landscape features, migration routes, or seasonal calendars in forms that functioned as external memory aids for navigational knowledge. You look around the valley from your position by the fire and try to orient yourself using any reference point your modern mind can locate. and come up almost entirely empty. The sun's position tells you east from west, which is something. The prevailing wind, which the group seems to use constantly and automatically as an orienting reference, provides additional directional information. Once you start paying attention to how the people around you relate to it, they angle their bodies to it, they use it to position their work, they reference it in ways that suggest it is as natural a compass as magnetic north is to anyone with a modern device. But beyond these basic orientations, the specific geography of this landscape is encoded nowhere in your experience or memory. The hills to the north could be any hills. The river you can hear but not see to the east could be any river. The distant shimmer that might be the ice sheet on the northern horizon could be anywhere along its vast southern edge. Nature still has one more surprise waiting in the social geography of this landscape, which is that the group's territory, the area they know intimately and move through seasonally, is far larger than the immediate valley suggests. Ice Age hunter-gatherer groups were not static. They were highly mobile, following the seasonal movements of game herds, the ripening cycles of plant foods, the predictable locations of water sources across a yearly cycle that might cover hundreds of kilometers. Their geographic knowledge was not the knowledge of a single place, but of an entire seasonal circuit, a landscape read through time as well as space, where knowing where to be in late spring was as important as knowing where to shelter in deep winter. Scientists still debate the precise territorial ranges of different Ice Age human populations and how those ranges varied by region, season, and ecological context. Evidence from the distribution of raw materials used in tool making, specific types of flint, obsidian, and other stone that can be traced to particular geological sources, allows researchers to map minimum movement distances with some confidence, and the results consistently indicate mobility ranges that dwarf what most modern people would consider practical for foot travel. Distances of 200 to 400 kilometers between a stone source and its archaeological destination are not unusual, though whether this represents direct travel by a single group or exchange between multiple groups across a chain of social connections is often impossible to determine with certainty. One of the older members of the group, a woman whose face carries the particular weathered quality of someone who has spent decades reading the sky, has been watching you with measured attention since you sat down by the fire. She says something in a language you cannot understand, and several people nearby respond in ways that suggest the group is discussing you with the calm, practical interest of people who assess new situations as a professional habit. You meet her eyes and feel, with sudden and unexpected clarity, that she knows things about this landscape, about this entire frozen, magnificent, hostile world, that you could spend a lifetime trying to learn and still not fully reach. The woman by the fire holds your gaze for a moment longer, then turns back to whatever she was doing before you arrived, working a piece of hide with a bone tool, her hands moving with the automatic fluency of someone for whom this motion is as natural as breathing. Around you, the camp resumes its rhythm. The brief interruption of your arrival absorbed and processed and set aside with the practical efficiency of people who do not have the luxury of extended novelty. Children who had been watching you cautiously from behind adult legs drift back to their activities. Someone adds a carefully selected piece of bone to the fire. Bone burns well when the marrow fat within it ignites, and in a landscape where wood is scarce, as it often was on the open mammoth steppe, bone was a genuine and important fuel source. the fire settles and steadies, and the thin column of smoke resumes its patient climb toward the pale morning sky. And now, sitting in this camp, warmer than you have been since you arrived, with people around you and the immediate crises of last night temporarily suspended, you have enough cognitive space to appreciate what is sitting at the absolute center of everything this group does, everything they build, everything they eat, everything they wear, and everything they survive on. It is something so fundamental to Ice Age life that its absence would unravel the entire fabric of daily existence within days. It is fire, and the people in this camp relate to it with a reverence and a practical seriousness that is completely appropriate, given what it actually means to them. You have already understood, in a general way, that fire matters in this world. Last night made that abundantly clear. But sitting here in the morning, watching how this group manages their fire, the deliberate way fuel is selected and added, the way the pit is constructed to maximize heat retention and minimize smoke in the wind's direction, the way at least one person always seems to be positioned where they can monitor it, you begin to understand that fire management in the Ice Age was not simply a skill. It was closer to a continuous, collective responsibility, a living obligation that the group maintained, the way a modern hospital maintains critical systems. It did not stop. It did not get a day off. It required attention and knowledge and material inputs every single day, in conditions that made all of those things consistently difficult to provide. The widely accepted scientific fact is that controlled use of fire by human ancestors extends back potentially 1 million years or more, with evidence from sites in Africa suggesting early fire use long before anatomically modern humans appeared. By the time of the Ice Age, fire making and fire keeping were deeply established parts of human technological culture, with multiple techniques documented across different populations. The two primary fire-making methods evidenced in the prehistoric record are percussion, striking flint or pyrite against iron-bearing stone to produce sparks directed into tinder, and friction, using a wooden drill or bow drill system to generate heat through rapid rotation against a softwood fireboard. Both methods work. Both methods require specific materials, specific technique, and a prepared tinder bundle of dried plant fiber, fungus, or other finely textured combustible material that will catch a spark or ember and hold it long enough to be nursed into flame. But things are about to get stranger, because the gap between knowing these methods exist and being able to execute them reliably in cold conditions, with cold hands, using whatever materials the immediate landscape provides, is enormous in ways that are genuinely humbling to confront. The surprising, lesser-known fact is about failure rates. Modern survival instructors who teach primitive fire-making, people who practice these techniques deliberately and regularly, frequently emphasize that reliable fire-making using friction or percussion methods takes months of consistent practice to achieve, and that even experienced practitioners fail under suboptimal conditions. Wet materials, cold hands, wind, and fatigue all degrade performance significantly in a cold, windy, Ice Age environment with hands that have spent the night approaching frostbite. Attempting to make fire from scratch using a bow drill or percussion method is an exercise that many modern survivalists, even experienced ones, would approach with genuine anxiety. The tinder must be perfectly dry. The technique must be precise. The physical effort required, particularly for friction methods, is substantial, and the window between generating a viable ember and losing it to wind or cold is narrow enough that missing it means starting over from the beginning. This is why firekeeping, rather than fire-making, was almost certainly the primary strategy in Ice Age groups. Rather than relying on the ability to make fire from scratch whenever needed, groups maintained continuous fires and developed strategies for transporting fire when moving camp. Evidence from archaeological sites suggests the use of containers, likely made from bark, hide, or shell, that could hold smoldering material safely enough to carry it across distances during group movements. Some researchers have pointed to certain portable stone artifacts with fire-scorched interiors as possible fire-carrying containers. The psychological and practical stakes of losing a group's fire were severe enough that fire transport was almost certainly treated as a serious logistical priority whenever a camp was relocated. Nature still has one more surprise, waiting in the material requirements of sustained fire, which is what fuel scarcity actually meant for Ice Age groups in open environments. The mammoth steppe, as productive as it was in terms of large animals, was not heavily forested. Trees were scarce across much of the steppe landscape, concentrated along rivers and in sheltered valleys, but absent across vast stretches of open ground. This meant that fuel had to be actively sought, collected, and managed rather than simply gathered from the immediate surroundings. Dried dung from large herbivores, mammoths, bison, horses, reindeer, was almost certainly used as fuel, as it is in fuel-scarce environments across the world today and into recent historical times. Fat-soaked bones provided another fuel source. Where wood was available, it was collected, transported, and likely rationed with a care that modern people, who have never had to think about fuel availability, would find surprising. Scientists still debate the precise fire management strategies of different Ice Age populations, and the evidence from archaeological hearths, which preserve charcoal, burned bone, and sometimes ash layers that can be chemically analyzed, continues to produce nuanced and sometimes unexpected results about what people were burning and how their fires were structured. What the evidence consistently demonstrates is intentionality. Ice Age fires were not accidental or casual. They were engineered, managed, and maintained with a sophistication that reflects thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about combustion, fuel, and thermal management. Someone in the camp adds another piece of bone to the fire, and the flames respond with a brief, bright flare as the marrow fat catches. The warmth on your face intensifies for a moment, and you close your eyes and simply feel it. The oldest technology in the human story, doing the work it has always done, holding the cold at bay for one more morning in a world where the cold never really stops trying. The morning moves forward with the slow, purposeful rhythm of the camp around you, and you find yourself settling into a kind of watchful quiet. Not comfortable exactly, not warm enough for comfort, but stable in a way that last night's exposed. Solitary darkness was not. You observe the people around you with the attention of someone who has nothing useful to contribute and knows it. A group of 3 adults leave camp together, moving northeast, carrying tools, and moving with the coordinated, unhurried pace of people on a specific errand that requires no discussion because it has been planned already. 2 adolescents are practicing something with a length of cord and a series of small weighted objects, repeating a motion over and over with the focused repetition of deliberate skill acquisition. An older man near the fire's edge is doing something with a piece of antler and a small stone tool, his eyes close to the work, his hands moving with the minute precision of someone operating well within their competence. What you are watching, you slowly realize, is not simply a group of people going about their day. You are watching a functioning psychological ecosystem, a community of minds that has developed, through long necessity, a set of shared frameworks for making the uncontrollable controllable, the unpredictable predictable, and the genuinely terrifying manageable enough to live with. Because here is the aspect of Ice Age survival that physical hardship alone cannot fully account for. The interior experience of it, the psychological texture of living in a world that offers almost no certainty, almost no buffer against misfortune, and almost no period of genuine relief from the awareness that the environment is consistently and non-personally trying to end you. This is the part of Ice Age survival that modern comfort has most thoroughly insulated you from, and it may be the hardest gap to bridge. But things are about to get stranger, because the psychological challenges of Ice Age life were not simply the challenges of individual stress management. They were structural features of the environment that shaped cognition, culture, social organization, and almost certainly the inner life of every person who experienced them in ways that researchers are only beginning to systematically explore. The widely accepted scientific fact here involves seasonal affective patterns and their relationship to Ice Age light environments. At the latitudes where many Ice Age human populations lived, across much of Europe and northern Asia, winter brought not just cold, but dramatically reduced daylight. In the depths of winter, at 50 degrees north latitude, which covers much of Central Europe, daylight lasts perhaps 8 hours, and the quality of that light, pale, low angle, frequently obscured by overcast skies, is significantly less than summer light in both intensity and spectrum. The human circadian system, mood regulation, and vitamin D synthesis are all sensitive to light exposure, and the long dark winters of Ice Age high latitudes would have produced physiological effects on the people experiencing them that are not trivially different from what modern medicine recognizes as seasonal affective disorder, fatigue, low mood, disrupted sleep, reduced motivation. These are not modern inventions. They are physiological responses to light deprivation that Ice Age humans experienced without any modern interventions available to address them. The surprising lesser-known fact is about how Ice Age humans may have actively managed these psychological pressures through cultural means, and this is where the evidence from prehistoric art becomes particularly fascinating. The concentration of cave painting and other symbolic activity in the deepest, darkest, most acoustically resonant parts of cave systems has long puzzled researchers who interpret the art primarily through an aesthetic lens. But some researchers have proposed that these deep cave spaces functioned partly as ceremonial environments, places where firelight, sound, communal gathering, and symbolic activity created altered states of consciousness or heightened emotional experiences that served important psychological and social functions for the groups that used them. The darkness itself, in this interpretation, was not a practical obstacle to the art, but potentially a feature of the experience, a sensory environment that amplified the impact of firelit imagery and communal ritual in ways that the open daylight world could not replicate. You look at the fire and try to imagine spending weeks or months of a deep Ice Age winter in a world where the sun barely clears the horizon at midday, where the cold never relents, where the landscape outside the shelter offers nothing that could be called inviting or restorative. Modern research on psychological resilience in isolated, extreme environments, Antarctic stations, polar expeditions, extended cave research projects, consistently finds that social cohesion, shared ritual and routine, humor, storytelling, and maintained aesthetic practices are among the most important buffers against psychological deterioration. The people around this fire almost certainly understood this in practical terms, even without the theoretical framework that modern psychology would use to describe it. Nature still has one more surprise waiting in the cognitive demands of Ice Age daily life, which is that the mental load of hunter-gatherer existence was not lighter than modern cognitive life. It was different, and in some respects, more immediately demanding. Tracking animals requires the ability to read and interpret a complex set of environmental signals: footprints, disturbed vegetation, scat, smell, sound, and build from them an accurate, predictive model of where an animal is, where it is going, and how to intercept it. Navigating a large territory requires maintaining a detailed mental map of hundreds of square kilometers, updated continuously through experience and cross-referenced with seasonal and weather information. Managing social relationships within a group where cooperation is survival critical requires sophisticated theory of mind, the ability to model other people's mental states, predict their responses, and navigate the complex web of obligations, alliances, and tensions that any close-knit community generates. Scientists still debate the relationship between the cognitive demands of hunter-gatherer life and the evolutionary development of human intelligence, with some researchers arguing that the social complexity of group living was the primary driver of human cognitive evolution, others emphasizing ecological problem-solving, and others pointing to the role of language and symbolic thought as both driver and product of expanding cognitive capacity. The honest answer is probably that these factors were deeply intertwined, each driving the others in a feedback system whose full dynamics we are still working to understand. The woman who was working the hide earlier has set down her bone tool and is speaking, telling something. You realize after a moment, not reporting or instructing, but narrating. Her voice has taken on a particular quality, a rhythm and cadence distinct from the practical exchanges happening elsewhere in the camp, and the people near her have shifted their posture slightly in the way that people do when they are listening, rather than simply hearing. Children have drifted closer. The older man has set down his antler work. Whatever she is saying, whatever story or song or recitation this is, it is doing something for the people, receiving it that goes beyond the transmission of information. You watch their faces in the firelight and see something there that is completely familiar and completely human, something that no amount of temporal distance or cultural difference can make unrecognizable. They are, in the middle of all of this cold and difficulty and uncertainty, finding a way to be somewhere else together for a little while. And that, perhaps more than any tool or technique or physical adaptation, is what has always made us who we are. The story or song or recitation ends the way these things tend to end in communities where they serve real functions, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gradual softening, the narrator's voice settling back into its ordinary register, the listeners releasing their focused attention by degrees and returning to their various tasks with the quiet ease of people who have just been somewhere and have now come back. A child near the fire has fallen asleep against an adult's leg, which seems both entirely reasonable, given that the child was probably up before dawn, and entirely remarkable, given that the ground is frozen and the air temperature is something that your modern thermostat would register as an emergency. Children in the Ice Age, you are beginning to understand, were not smaller, more fragile versions of the adults around them so much as highly compressed apprentice versions, learning, absorbing, adapting, and enduring at a rate and scale that would surprise most modern assumptions about what children require in order to thrive. This brings you, sitting by the fire in the pale morning light, to one of the aspects of Ice Age life that tends to generate the most complicated feelings in modern people who spend time thinking about it carefully. Not the predators, not the cold, not the hunger. Those register as dramatic and immediate. What generates the complicated feelings is this: the children, the infants, the question of how new life survived its earliest and most vulnerable stages in an environment that was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinarily hostile to fragility of any kind. The answer is both more hopeful and more sobering than you might expect. The widely accepted scientific fact about Ice Age childhood survival is that infant and child mortality rates were dramatically higher than anything the modern developed world considers normal. Archaeological evidence from prehistoric burial sites, combined with paleodemographic modeling, suggests that perhaps a third to half of all children born in Ice Age populations did not survive to adulthood. This is not a figure that should be absorbed quickly or lightly. It represents a texture of lived experience, of grief, of loss, of the specific weight of loving something small and vulnerable in a world that makes no accommodations for smallness or vulnerability, that shaped every aspect of how these communities functioned and how they understood life and death. But things are about to get stranger, because the response of Ice Age communities to this reality was not passive acceptance or emotional detachment, as older anthropological models sometimes suggested. The evidence points in a different direction entirely. Prehistoric burials of children and infants, and there are many of them, recovered from sites across Eurasia, frequently contain grave goods of notable quality and care. Beads, ochre, carefully placed tools, ornaments made from materials that represent significant labor investment. A famous burial from Sunghir in Russia, dating to around 30,000 years ago, contains the remains of two children interred together with an extraordinary collection of grave goods, thousands of carefully crafted mammoth ivory beads that would have required an estimated 10,000 hours of labor to produce, along with ivory spears, carved figurines, and foxtooth ornaments. These children were buried with more material wealth than most adult burials from the same period. Whatever this means, and researchers continue to debate its precise social and symbolic significance, it does not suggest emotional indifference to the lives and deaths of children. It suggests the opposite. The surprising, lesser-known fact is about the logistics of Ice Age infancy, and specifically about carrying. In a highly mobile, hunter-gatherer society, where the group must move regularly to follow resources, infants who cannot yet walk must be carried. And carrying an infant while also performing the physical work of daily survival requires a specific technological solution. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that Ice Age peoples used carrying devices, slings and carriers made from hide, that allowed infants to be kept close to the caregiver's body, which served both the practical purpose of freeing the caregiver's hands and the physiological purpose of keeping the infant warm through body heat transfer. A small infant carried against an adult body in a well-designed hide carrier is in a microclimate dramatically warmer than the ambient air temperature. It is, in effect, a portable shelter specifically scaled to the most thermally vulnerable member of the group. Nature still has one more surprise waiting in the communal structure of Ice Age childcare, which is that the nuclear family model, two parents exclusively responsible for their own children, was almost certainly not the primary operating structure of Ice Age child rearing. The cooperative breeding hypothesis, developed and refined by researchers, including anthropologist Sarah Hrdy, proposes that human children evolved in environments where care was distributed across multiple adults beyond the biological parents, grandparents, older siblings, unrelated group members, and that this distributed care structure was not a social nicety, but a biological necessity that shaped the evolution of human childhood itself. Human children have an unusually long period of dependence compared to other primates. They require more calories, more protection, and more direct care for a longer period than any comparable species. This extended dependence only makes evolutionary sense if the caregiving load was reliably distributed across multiple individuals, rather than falling entirely on two parents who also had to hunt, gather, process food, make clothing, maintain shelter, and manage every other survival requirement simultaneously. Scientists still debate the precise structure and extent of cooperative breeding in Ice Age human populations, and the evidence from modern hunter-gatherer societies used to model prehistoric behavior shows considerable variation in how child care is distributed across different cultural contexts. What the evidence consistently supports is that grandmothers, in particular, played a significant and possibly evolutionarily crucial role in Ice Age child survival. The grandmother hypothesis proposes that the evolution of post-reproductive lifespan in human females is directly connected to the survival value of experienced older women contributing to the care and provisioning of grandchildren. An Ice Age grandmother who knew where the edible plants grew, who could process hides and make clothing, who could care for infants while parents hunted, who carried decades of accumulated environmental knowledge. That person was not a peripheral figure in the group's survival equation. She was central to it. The child sleeping against the adult's leg stirs slightly, resettles, and goes still again. The adult adjusts their position without looking down, a gesture so automatic it barely registers as conscious action. The particular fluid attentiveness of someone whose awareness of this small person has become as continuous and background as breathing. Across the fire, someone is nursing an infant while simultaneously using a stone tool to work a piece of bone. The two activities running in parallel with the practiced ease of someone for whom neither requires dedicated attention anymore. You watch all of this and feel the weight of what it means, the love and the loss, and the extraordinary daily effort of keeping small humans alive in this world. Settling into the quiet space that the morning has opened up around the fire, the three adults who left camp earlier, moving northeast, return in the late morning, carrying between them the haunches of what appears to be a large deer, and the camp receives this development with the particular calibrated response of people who have learned not to waste energy on theatrical celebration, but who understand very precisely what a successful hunt means for the next several days. There is purposeful movement, tools appearing, tasks being organized with the quiet efficiency of a group that has done this many times and knows exactly how the work should be divided. The fire is built up. Children are repositioned away from the working area. The older man, who is working the antler, sets down his project and moves toward the returning hunters with a focused attention that suggests his particular skills are needed for what comes next. You watch all of this and feel, alongside the relief of knowing that food is coming, a sudden and specific awareness that you have been thinking about this group in a way that requires adjustment, because there is something you have not yet fully reckoned with, something that the firelight and the shared warmth and the gradual sense of inclusion have allowed you to temporarily bracket, which is that the humans in this camp, the ones who have fed you and warmed you and tolerated your presence with such practical generosity, are probably not the only humans in this landscape, and the others you might encounter would not necessarily be the same kind of people, speaking the same kind of language, sharing the same cultural frameworks, or the same definition of who belongs inside the circle of obligation and mutual support. This is where the Ice Age becomes complicated in a different register entirely, not physically, but philosophically, anthropologically, and in ways that modern science is still actively, and sometimes heatedly, trying to understand. The widely accepted scientific fact is that during the period of the last glacial maximum and the broader time frame surrounding it, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, were not the only human species on Earth. Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, had inhabited Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans arrived, and the most recent evidence suggests they persisted in some regions until approximately 40,000 years ago. Denisovans, known primarily from fragmentary remains, recovered from a cave in Siberia, but increasingly understood through ancient DNA analysis, inhabited parts of Asia, and likely a broader range that we are still mapping. The picture of human prehistory that emerges from the last 2 decades of ancient DNA research is dramatically more complex and more interesting than the simple linear narrative that older models proposed. But things are about to get stranger because the nature of the interactions between these different human groups, Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, Denisovans, is one of the most actively debated and genuinely unresolved questions in all of paleoanthropology, and the evidence keeps producing surprises. The surprising, lesser-known fact is one that has become somewhat more widely known in recent years, but still generates genuine astonishment when people encounter it properly for the first time. Modern humans outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry, on average, approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. Modern humans in parts of Oceania and Southeast Asia carry an additional component of Denisovan ancestry, with some populations in Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians showing Denisovan ancestry estimates of 4 to 6%. This is not metaphorical or cultural inheritance. It is literal genetic material incorporated into the human genome through interbreeding events that occurred tens of thousands of years ago and that have been detectable only since the development of ancient DNA sequencing technology in the last 15 years or so. You, specifically, if you are of non-African descent, are carrying a small but real and measurable portion of Neanderthal genetic heritage in every cell of your body right now. The truly odd part comes later in understanding what this genetic evidence does and does not tell us about the nature of those encounters. The presence of Neanderthal DNA in modern human genomes tells us definitively that interbreeding occurred, that there were encounters between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals that produced viable offspring who survived and reproduced, and whose descendants eventually became us. It does not tell us how frequent these encounters were, how they were initiated, how they were received, or what either party understood about the nature of the beings they were interacting with. The encounters could have ranged across an enormous spectrum of possible dynamics, from peaceful exchange and genuine social integration to conflict and everything between. And the genetic evidence alone cannot distinguish between these possibilities. Scientists still debate with considerable energy and some passion, the precise nature of the relationship between modern humans and Neanderthals, including the question of whether modern human expansion contributed to Neanderthal extinction through direct competition, indirect ecological displacement, introduced disease, or some combination of factors. Some researchers have argued for a relatively peaceful coexistence and gradual integration model. Others have argued for a replacement model in which modern humans outcompeted Neanderthals for resources with relatively little direct interaction. The honest current position is that the evidence supports elements of multiple models and that the relationship probably varied enormously by region, time period, and local ecological circumstances, making any single characterization an oversimplification. What is not debated is that Neanderthals were not the brutish, dim-witted, cave-dwelling stereotypes that dominated popular imagery for most of the 20th century. The archaeological evidence for Neanderthal behavior, including evidence of deliberate burial of their dead, the use of pigments that suggest body decoration or symbolic behavior, the manufacture of sophisticated composite tools, and the exploitation of a remarkably wide range of environments paints a picture of a cognitively capable, behaviorally flexible, socially organized human species that was far more similar to Homo sapiens than the old caricature acknowledged. They cared for their injured and elderly, as evidenced by skeletons showing healed severe injuries that would have required sustained care to survive. They used fire. They made music, possibly a cave bear bone with holes that may represent a flute has been recovered from a Neanderthal site, though its interpretation remains debated. You look at the people around the fire, their faces, their hands, their eyes, and try to imagine encountering someone who was recognizably human, who made tools and fire and cared for their children, but who was also measurably, perceptibly different in ways that you might not have the conceptual framework to process. Broader, heavier boned, with a distinctive facial architecture, prominent brow ridges, a projecting mid-face, no chin, speaking perhaps, or communicating in ways that suggested language without quite mapping onto any language structure you knew. The philosophical weight of that encounter, what it would mean, how you would respond, what category your mind would reach for to make sense of it, is not a question the Ice Age offers any easy answers to. The deer is being processed efficiently around you, the group working with practiced coordination. Someone passes you a piece of cooked meat, warm from proximity to the fire, and you accept it with the particular gratitude of someone who has been hungry long enough that food has stopped being a preference and become something closer to a biological negotiation. You eat slowly, carefully, and try to be present in this moment, rather than lost in the enormous questions the morning has opened up. The meat is extraordinary, not because it is particularly tender, or seasoned, or prepared in any way that a modern kitchen would recognize as sophisticated. It is none of those things, but because your body receives it with the focused, cellular gratitude of something that has been running on emergency reserves and has just been informed that the emergency is temporarily suspended. You eat slowly as the group around you eats, in the communal quiet that shared food tends to produce in people who understand its value. The fire pops and settles. The pale winter sun has climbed to its modest midday height and is already beginning its early descent, because in this latitude and this season, the sun does not linger. It makes its brief appearance and then retreats, as if it too finds the conditions somewhat challenging. You have been in this world for something approaching 2 full days now. and the accumulated experience of it has begun to produce a specific kind of understanding that purely intellectual engagement with Ice Age history cannot quite replicate. Not expertise. You are nowhere near expertise, and the people around you would find the suggestion politely baffling, but a bodily, immediate comprehension of what this life actually costs. The caloric math, the thermal math, the constant low-level problem solving that never fully resolves because the environment never fully cooperates. The way every small success, warmth, food, shelter, social connection exists against a background of ongoing effort that cannot be suspended without consequences, and then, gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, something begins to change. It starts as a quality of light, a slight softening at the horizon that you might dismiss as afternoon haze if you did not notice that the older members of the group are responding to it. The woman who told the story this morning has stepped away from the fire and is looking south and west with an attention that is different from her usual watchful calm. It is more active than that, more interrogative, as if she is reading something in the sky that requires careful interpretation. Others notice her attention and follow it. There is a brief exchange in the language you cannot understand, and the camp's rhythm shifts, not urgently but purposefully, in the way that experienced people respond to information that requires action but not panic. What she is reading in that sky, you will eventually understand, is the beginning of something that took the Ice Age world thousands of years to complete, but that, in the very long view of prehistoric time, represents one of the most significant environmental transformations in human experience. The ice is, almost imperceptibly, beginning to melt. Not today, not this season, perhaps not this decade, but the very long, very slow, very consequential process of glacial retreat, the end of the last glacial maximum, and the beginning of the current interglacial period that we still inhabit today, has begun its work somewhere in the vast climatic system that governs this world, and the people who read this landscape most carefully are beginning to sense its first distant signals. The widely accepted scientific fact is that the transition from the last glacial maximum to the current interglacial period, called the Holocene, was not a sudden or uniform event. It unfolded over thousands of years, roughly between 18,000 and 10,000 years ago, with significant regional variation in timing and rate of change. Sea levels rose as glaciers melted. The 120 meters of sea level rise that separated the Ice Age world from the modern one did not happen overnight, but accumulated gradually over millennia, drowning coastlines and reshaping continents with a patience that made it invisible to any individual human lifetime, while being utterly transformative across generations. The Doggerland that connected Britain to Europe did not flood in a day. It shrank season by season, decade by decade, until the land bridge became an island chain, and the island chain disappeared beneath the rising North Sea. But things are about to get stranger, because the end of the Ice Age was not experienced by the humans living through it as liberation. It was experienced as disruption, profound, continuous, multi-generational disruption that demanded constant adaptation from people who were already operating at the edge of their adaptive capacity. The surprising, lesser-known fact is about the speed of some of the climate changes embedded within the broader warming trend. The overall transition from Ice Age to Holocene was gradual, but it was punctuated by events of startling rapidity by geological standards. A climate event called the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that occurred approximately 12,900 years ago, saw temperatures in parts of the North Atlantic region drop dramatically within decades, possibly within years, before recovering again over the following millennium. The cause was likely a disruption of ocean circulation patterns triggered by the sudden release of enormous quantities of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic. For the human populations living through it, the Younger Dryas was not a data point in a climate record. It was a catastrophic reversal of what had seemed like improving conditions. The animals changing their ranges, the plants retreating, the food systems reorganizing around a new and unexpected cold regime that no one had anticipated and no previous generation's knowledge had prepared them for. Nature still has one more surprise waiting in the ecological cascade that accompanied glacial retreat, which is the extinction of the megafauna. The great animals that have populated this entire narrative, the woolly mammoths, the cave lions, the woolly rhinoceroses, the giant ground sloths of North America, the short-faced bears, were gone by the end of the Pleistocene, and their disappearance represents one of the most discussed and most genuinely unresolved debates in all of paleontology. The timing of megafauna extinctions across different continents correlates with two things simultaneously: the arrival of modern humans and the end ice age climate change. And disentangling the relative contributions of these two factors has occupied researchers for decades without producing consensus. Scientists still debate with considerable passion whether human hunting, the overkill hypothesis, or climate-driven habitat change was the primary driver of Pleistocene megafauna extinction, with most current researchers favoring some version of a combined model in which human pressure and environmental change interacted synergistically to produce extinction outcomes that neither factor alone might have achieved. The debate matters beyond academic interest because it speaks directly to questions about human ecological impact that remain urgently relevant today. Were the people who stood where you are standing now agents of extinction, or witnesses to it, or both? The group around you is breaking camp with the organized efficiency of people who have done this many times, hides being folded and secured, tools being packed into carriers, the fire being carefully managed down rather than simply abandoned, because fire is too valuable to waste and the embers can be transported. Children are being settled into carrying arrangements. The older man has resumed his antler work. Even while walking, his hands apparently capable of continuing the task independently of whatever his feet are doing. The woman who read the sky catches your eye as she passes, carrying a substantial bundle with the easy strength of someone for whom this weight is unremarkable. She says something brief and direct in her language, and though you understand none of the specific words, the meaning is communicated clearly enough by tone and gesture and the direction everyone is moving. We are going. Come or stay. The landscape will not wait. You stand, feeling the cold reassert itself immediately now that you are away from the fire, and you follow. Because the alternative is staying in a valley that is already emptying, with a dying fire and a landscape that has demonstrated comprehensively over the past 2 days that it has no interest in accommodating people who do not know what they are doing. And because somewhere in the experience of these 2 days, the cold and the hunger and the dark and the fire and the meat and the story and the sleeping child and the sky that the woman read this morning, something has shifted in how you understand the people you are walking with. They are not surviving the ice age, they are living in it. And that distinction, quiet as it is, changes everything. You walk with the group through the afternoon, and the walking itself becomes a kind of meditation. The crunch of boots on frozen ground, the rhythm of breath misting in cold air, the slow processional movement of people who have learned to cover distance efficiently without wasting energy on speed that the landscape does not reward. The children keep up with a matter-of-fact endurance that continues to quietly reframe your assumptions about what children are capable of when capability is not optional. The older members of the group move with a particular economy of motion, each step placed with the unconscious precision of people who have read this kind of terrain for decades and whose bodies have learned to negotiate it without requiring conscious instruction. The landscape around you is changing slightly as you move. The open plain giving way to a shallow river valley where scrubby willows and dwarf birch cluster along the frozen watercourse, their branches carrying a thin glaze of ice that catches the low afternoon light and turns it briefly, beautifully silver. A small herd of horses, stocky, thick-coated, nothing like the graceful animals of modern equestrian imagery, crosses the valley floor, perhaps 400 meters ahead, moving with the same unhurried patience as the reindeer you saw on your first morning here, which now feels like a different lifetime, even though it was only yesterday. You watch the horses and think about everything that stands between you and surviving this world independently, not as an exercise in self-criticism, but as a genuine accounting. The knowledge you lack, the skills you have not built, the physical adaptations your body has not made, the social bonds you have not had decades to develop. The list is long and specific and honest. You could not make fire reliably. You could not process a hide. You could not navigate this landscape with any confidence beyond the most basic solar orientation. You could not identify which plants were edible and which were not, which animal behaviors signaled danger and which were routine, which weather signs the woman read this morning were meaningful and which were background noise. You could not make the tools that make the other skills possible. You could not stitch the clothing that makes shelter survivable. You could not read the landscape the way these people read it, as a text, dense with information, written in a language that takes a lifetime to learn, and that no single person ever fully masters. The widely accepted scientific fact that closes this particular accounting is one of the most quietly humbling in all of human prehistory. The people who survived the Ice Age, who not only survived it, but thrived within it sufficiently to produce art of breathtaking beauty, to maintain social networks spanning hundreds of kilometers, to develop technologies of extraordinary sophistication, to raise children and bury their dead with care and ceremony, were not biologically different from you in any meaningful way. They had the same brain, the same body, the same emotional range, the same cognitive capacity, the same fundamental human architecture. The difference between them and you is not nature. It is accumulated knowledge, knowledge built across thousands of generations, transmitted with extraordinary care, embodied in practice and skill and relationship and story, and calibrated to an environment with a specificity and depth that no individual could develop in a single lifetime. But things are about to get stranger in a way that circles back to everything this journey has been building toward. Because the knowledge that kept Ice Age humans alive was not lost when the Ice Age ended. It transformed. It adapted. It followed the warming climate and the retreating glaciers and the rising seas into new configurations. The same human intelligence and social creativity that built mammoth bone shelters and fat-burning lamps and bone needle-tailored clothing, turning itself toward agriculture, toward pottery, toward metallurgy, toward writing, toward every subsequent chapter of the human story. The Ice Age humans who made it through were your direct ancestors, and the cognitive and social tools they developed under those conditions are the foundation on which everything that followed was built. The surprising, lesser-known fact is about what we lost in that transition, alongside everything we gained. The deep ecological knowledge that Ice Age hunter-gatherers carried, the intimate, multi-generational familiarity with specific landscapes, specific animals, specific plants, specific weather patterns, is a form of knowledge that agriculture and urbanization have progressively diluted for most of the human population over the 10,000 years since the Ice Age ended. Modern hunter-gatherer peoples, who still practice traditional lifeways, carry versions of this knowledge that researchers increasingly recognize as sophisticated, precise, and ecologically valuable in ways that Western science is only beginning to adequately appreciate. The rest of us have traded it, largely without noticing, for a different set of knowledge and a different relationship with the environments we inhabit. Scientists still debate what this loss means, whether it represents a straightforward trade of one adaptive strategy for another, or whether something of genuine and irreplaceable value was surrendered in the transition from the deep ecological knowledge of the Ice Age to the abstracted, technologically mediated relationship with nature that characterizes most modern human existence. The debate is not merely academic. It connects directly to questions about sustainability, about ecological literacy, about what human beings need to know about the world they inhabit in order to inhabit it responsibly over the long term. The group has stopped at a place where the river valley widens into a broad, sheltered bowl, and the older members are reading the site with the practiced assessment of people who have used it before, or who recognize its qualities from descriptions passed down through the group's accumulated knowledge. The wind is reduced here, blocked by the valley walls. There is wood along the riverbank, actual wood, willow branches, enough to supplement the bone fuel and build a fire that will sustain the night more comfortably than the open plain would have allowed. The ground in the center of the bowl shows faint traces of previous occupation, a slight depression where a fire pit was dug, a discoloration of the soil that speaks of repeated use across many seasons, many years, possibly many generations. This place has been known. It has been returned to. It carries a history that the landscape holds in its earth and that the group holds in its memory, and the two forms of memory meet here and confirm each other. Camp is made with the efficiency you have now watched enough times to begin to anticipate, the fire coming first, then the shelters, then the organization of food and tools, and sleeping arrangements with a logic that assigns roles not by instruction, but by shared understanding of who does what and why. You find a place near the fire and lower yourself to the ground, and the warmth finds you immediately, and the light is already going again, that pale Ice Age light making its daily withdrawal, the stars beginning their patient reappearance in the darkening sky above the valley walls. You are tired in a way that goes deeper than ordinary fatigue, a tiredness that has accumulated layer by layer across 2 days of cold and hunger and sensory intensity and emotional recalibration, and it is the kind of tired that promises sleep rather than merely suggesting it. And here, at the end of this long journey through a world that no longer exists, is the thing worth carrying with you into the night. The Ice Age humans, who lived through what you have barely survived for 2 days, were not tougher than you in any fundamental sense. They were not a different kind of human. They were people who had been given, by the long patient work of culture and community and accumulated generational knowledge, the tools to live in their world the way you have been given the tools to live in yours. The tools are different, the worlds are different, but the humans holding them are the same. You would not survive the Ice Age alone. Neither would they, if you dropped them into yours without preparation. The survival was never individual. It was never solo. It was always, in every version of the human story worth telling, a collective achievement, knowledge shared, burdens distributed, fire tended through the night by people who understood that the warmth belonged to everyone or it belonged to no one. The fire settles. The valley is quiet. The stars are extraordinary again tonight, blazing with that impossible Ice Age clarity above the dark walls of the bowl. And somewhere in the middle distance, a mammoth moves through the darkness with the slow, unhurried dignity of something that has been here far longer than you and will. For a little while longer, at least. Continue to be here, long after you are gone. Now let the sounds around you soften. Let the images of the frozen plain, the pale fire, the watchful woman, the sleeping child by the hearth, begin to blur gently at their edges, the way all memories do when the mind is finally ready to release the day. You have traveled a long way tonight, across 20,000 years, across a landscape that has since been swallowed by rising seas and retreating ice and 10 millennia of human transformation. And your body knows it, even if all you did was listen. The cold that pressed against you on that open plain is far away now. What remains is warmth, the warmth of the fire in that sheltered valley, the warmth of the group sleeping close together in the dark, the warmth of understanding that the people who came before you were not primitive or simple or lesser, but were fully, completely, magnificently human in every sense that word has ever carried. Let your breathing slow now. Let each exhale carry a little more of the day's tension out with it, dissolving into the quiet air of the room around you. The mammoth steppe is still out there somewhere, buried under the geography of the modern world, holding its fossils and its frozen memories in the permafrost, patient as glaciers. You do not need to hold it anymore tonight. The fire in the valley burns low and steady. The stars wheel slowly overhead. The woman who read the sky this morning is asleep now, her breathing even and deep, decades of accumulated knowledge resting quietly behind her closed eyes. The child is warm. The group is safe, for this night at least, in their sheltered bowl with their managed fire and their shared warmth and their 10,000 years of knowing how to be human in the hardest possible world. And you are warm too, wherever you are, in whatever room or bed or corner of the modern world you have made your small shelter tonight. That warmth is not so different from theirs. It is just newer and easier and built on everything they survived to give you. Sleep well,